All right, so I apologize. Some of these slides, the type came up a little bit light. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the overall theory of evolution and what the evidence is that supports the theory of evolution. We'll talk about what a theory means, but there's some key concepts and some vocabulary that I'm going to use often. So the first one is biodiversity. There is an extensive amount of biodiversity on our planet, and there are some areas that are more biodiverse than others. So what does that mean? Well, that means that there are, in that particular area, many different organisms, lots of different shapes of organisms, sizes of organisms, lots of different habitats. There are many different niches or environments for organisms to be a part of. And so biodiversity is a good thing. The more biodiversity that an area has, the more ecologically stable it's considered, because that means that that environment can support a lot of different organisms. So evolution is considered a theory. Now, a theory in science is not the same way that you think of a theory when someone just says they have a theory about something. A scientific theory is a collection of many scientific facts. It has thousands upon thousands of observations and hypotheses that support that theory. And so theories are highly supported by the science. It is not like the word theory being just thrown around in everyday language. Theory means that most scientists accept the conclusions and the facts and the observations that are being provided to them. Another thing is the word evolution. Lots of students tend to have a wrong notion of what the word evolution really means. So evolution means a change over time. And this change typically takes place over a time span that is difficult for students and people to fathom and understand. When we think about time, we think about time in our own lifespan, which is very short in evolutionary terms. Our own lifespan is only, 80 to 100 years, when evolution occurs over a span of millions and even billions of years. And so evolution is looking at a change over time of organisms. And we can see that even in the bacteria that we started studying and learning about the infections that people get from bacteria because they evolve so quickly. And then finally, again, theory is very well supported. It is a testable explanation of natural phenomenon. It is not a theory like many of us think of, like just a theory of being a guess. A theory is highly supported information. So the scientist that is credited with looking into and kind of developing the theory of evolution and overall natural selection was Charles Darwin. He was considered pretty much the father of evolution. He was born in England back in 1809, and he was a naturalist. He went on a voyage on the HMS Beagle back in 1831. He collected lots of observations. He collected all kinds of evidence. He is most famous for looking at the finches in the Galapagos Islands, as well as the tortoises in the Galapagos Islands. And he collected all this evidence and wrote a book and used all of the evidence to create his hypothesis. So if you are watching this because you're absent, this video is going to be linked into the notes. So go ahead and make sure to click on the teacher's notes and watch this video clip to learn more about Charles Darwin and the work he did. So you should have watched the video. You would have noticed that Darwin had noticed a lot of different patterns in the diversity. He noticed that the bird beaks of some of the organisms, some of the finches, were different sizes, and then he looked at the different types of foods that were available to those finches. He looked at the neck length of the tortoises, and he noticed how the neck length kind of corresponded with, again, the food that was available on those particular islands in the Galapagos for those organisms. So he noticed that as he went around the world, he saw that similar habitats still had different organisms. He collected fossils to see what the similarities were to existing species. He noticed that throughout the Galapagos Islands, there was a great variety in organisms based on the food that was available. And he came to some conclusions and noticed that islands being isolated from the land could then have species change over time because there's only certain foods that are available for the species on that island. And the species are kind of isolated. And so only those that have the traits that are going to be fit to be able to survive in that environment are going to survive and are going to be able to reproduce. And then those traits that are going to allow them to survive are going to be passed on to the offspring. And offspring that don't have those traits then are going to they're going to pass, and they're not going to pass their genetics on to the next generation. So these were some of the examples of the different tortoises that he found on the different islands. You can see that they do have some differences in the size of their shell, in the length of their necks, in the length of their front legs, the length of their back legs. And he concluded that all of this was due to the particular environment they were exposed to. They had to have traits that would allow them to be able to get their food and be able to survive. And so only the traits that were the appropriate traits to get their food were going to be the organisms that survived, and then those traits were passed on to the next generation. Now, during this time, Darwin was not the only scientist that was looking at this. There were actually a number of other scientists that were making similar conclusions to Darwin. For example, a scientist with the last name of Hutton was doing some studies on the natural processes of the earth, things like mountains, valleys, canyons, and he was making the statement that the earth was changing slowly over time through natural processes. Charles Lyell also was observing these processes and saying, I don't think these things could happen within a 100-year lifetime. These things have happened over processes that take thousands and millions of years. And then there was another famous scientist, Malthus, that was concerned with the human population growth and the resources that were available for humans to be able to survive. We need food, we need clean water, and our population was growing very quickly. And he was drawing the conclusion that there was not going to be enough resources available to support our entire human population. And some people were going to we were going to see a die-off of people not surviving because of the lack of those resources. So Darwin published his papers in 1859, just after Alfred Wallace wrote some similar papers, and Darwin had stated that there was inheritance, meaning that one generation got traits from the next generation, and that variation was selected upon. That sometimes if a trait was not favored by the environment, that those individuals would not be as successful at reproducing, and that trait we would see less of. And when a trait was more fit for the environment, then that trait would continue to be passed on from one next generation to the next. And so Darwin called this a struggle for existence. And that struggle for existence resulted in all the members of a species competing with each other. For example, if you have a group of lions, they are still all competing within their group to survive, to get the amount of food that they need, to not be taken down by another predator, to be not taken down by a disease, to overcome a sickness that they might have. All of that is part of the struggle for existence, and only those that do maintain and are able to reproduce are going to pass their genetics on to the next generation. So now when we talk about evolution, we talk about some very key words, and we want to make sure that we use these key words correctly. So first word is fitness. When we say fitness, that is the organism's ability to not only survive, but also to reproduce within the environment. If an organism is sterile, then they're not considered fit, because we have to see those genetics get passed from one generation to the next generation. So fitness is talking about being able to get the amount of food that you need so that you can reproduce and have offspring, to attract a mate, to withstand any sort of sicknesses that may come their way. Then we get to an adaptation. And a lot of times people use the word adaptation as a verb, like it's something that an organism chooses to do. But organisms don't choose to adapt. Adaptation is just something that occurs. An adaptation is something that is inherited. So, for example, an adaptation may be humans walking on two legs. We didn't choose to do it. We didn't make a conscious choice. It was a trait that increased our ability to be fit. It allowed for the Homo sapiens to move around faster and easier. It allowed for a change in body temperature through environments that were very, very hot through our evolutionary times. So adaptations are going to be traits that increase a fitness. So for example, those Galapagos Islands, those tortoises on the Galapagos Islands, some have different variations. A whole group of tortoises might be born to one mother, and some of them have longer necks and some of them have a little bit shorter necks. Just like some of us are taller, some of us are shorter. That's just natural variation. But if a particular trait is more fit to survival, then that trait is considered an adaptation that is increasing the fitness, improving the fitness. And so then we get to what is called survival of the fittest, which means the organisms that are best fit are going to survive and reproduce, and their offspring are going to have those similar traits that then are going to allow them to be able to survive and reproduce, and that trait continues to be passed on that is best suited to the environment. So again, if you're absent, you're going to want to click on the teacher notes and watch this video that reviews and recaps the process of survival of the fittest. So we get then a process that is called natural selection. Natural selection is basically survival of the fittest. Over time, the natural environment is going to basically determine which are the traits that are best fit for the environment and which are the traits that are not best fit for the environment, and which organisms are going to survive and reproduce and pass those inherited traits on to the next generation, and which ones are not going to survive and not going to be able to reproduce. And so as that process occurs, we get what is called descent with modification, which means that ancestors are slightly different from the previous generation. If you have great-grandparents who are still alive, you can look at your great-grandparents, you can look at your grandparents, you can look at your parents, and you can look at you, and you can see that there are different changes that just between those 4 generations that you can see within your ancestors. Everything from hair colors to eye colors to skin colors to disease susceptibility. Your ability to fight off different infections is going to change from generation to generation. And so that modification, those changes in your genetics, that's evolution. Evolution is occurring within your own family. Evolution is occurring within an entire environment throughout the entire human population. Every single generation, we see changes in the genetics. And that gradual change leads to different species from 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, than the species that is in existence today. So again, if you are absent, you need to watch this video clip. So we're going to focus for this week on the process of natural selection. We're going to focus on understanding what adaptations are. We're going to focus on understanding what descent with modification means, what survival of the fittest means, and then we will get into our evidences of evolution. There is a lot of evidence to support the theory of evolution. That is why it is considered a theory and not a hypothesis. We're going to look at the fossil record. We will look at geographical distribution of organisms, that is the location where different organisms are. We're going to look at and learn about what homologous structures as well as vestigial structures are. We're going to look at embryology as well as DNA sequencing. Now that we understand and we can sequence DNA, that has shifted some of the theories on which organisms are more closely or less closely related to other organisms as well. Okay, so in summary, individual organisms are different from other individual organisms. You look around the classroom, you can see that you've got lots of variations. Organisms that produce more offspring that can survive, and then there are organisms that do not survive and do not produce as many offspring. The more offspring there are, the more competition there is, and that competition is going to lead to only those that are best suited to the environment are going to survive and pass on their traits. Species that are alive today have descended or inherited their traits from previous ancestors, but there are modifications from the species of the past. And so as new research is developed, for example, the new DNA research that we have discovered and learned about in the last 50 years have changed the evolutionary theory, and we continue to change the evolutionary theory and the paths and the ideas of what is connected to what as the new research is discovered.